Hello out there in Radioland. This is Michael. This is the Street Preacher's Corner podcast. The podcast where we don't wear pointy hats and we don't wear ruby slippers. Well, as you can tell by the title, we are going a little bit off the reservation. I tell you, I have to admit that I personally, I don't know about you, but I find the 1692 witch trials of Salem, Massachusetts absolutely fascinating. One of the reasons that is that I, like you, I'm sometimes sort of drawn to the bizarre and the inexplicable, and there are events at Salem that have some pretty pedestrian explanations. In fact, there's some so pedestrian of an explanation that it really should have been obvious to the people at the time what they were seeing, and that there was no supernatural element to it. It was just a thing that was happening. There's some of those. There's some of those events in Salem that have those sort of explanations, and then there are other events that are just plain odd. And so I like it for that reason. And out of all the reasons, that's probably the most carnal one. So I figured I'd mention that first and get out of the way. Another reason I find this stuff fascinating is that even though they wrapped up about 400 years ago, well, probably over 400 years ago, so 1992 would have been 400 years ago, right? No, 300 years ago. See, this is math, which I'm normally very good at. Anyway, the witch trials are an amazing peek into your theology, and I'll explain what I'm saying. First of all, everybody has a theology, whether they call it that or not. There are no neutral players on the field, and it's like Doug Wilson says. Doug Wilson says everybody lives in a theocracy. The only question is which God is the God of your theocracy. And so Jesus said he was the way and the truth and the life. And as such, you cannot separate truth, real truth. You cannot separate real truth from life, in that they have the same source and they have the same embodiment in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. So the practical application of that idea is that what you believe, what you really believe, will always bear itself out in your actions, and vice versa. Your actions are what reveals what you believe. So your theology and your understanding of what is real and how it works will always dictate and play itself out in the things that you actually do. By the way, that is why all the modern scholarship, and I've read a bunch of it, the modern scholarship on the witch trials is absolute rubbish because it is founded upon bad theology. Let me give you just a couple examples that absolutely nobody asked for. We have here a quote from a modern day self-proclaimed witch. Now, let me just say, from the biblical perspective, witches are a thing. They exist. They have power. We could do a whole thing on witches. But this is a lady who is a self-proclaimed witch, and she goes by the name of Pippi Longstocking. No, Sophie St. Thomas. And she says, if you feel an urge to exert your own will and get what you want while fighting the patriarchy and practicing intersectional feminism, then you qualify as a witch. That's end quote. That's what she said. Now, do you see what a window that statement is into her heart? So Miss St. Thomas has borne out for us, in her own words, the scriptural adage that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. In her theology, she's oppressed and she's held back by the limitations put on her by nature and by nature's God. In her theology, she deserves to get her way, and the path she takes to get her way is occultism. Cotton Mather, the Puritan writer, and he's sort of a Salem contemporary. I say sort of. He was pretty fairly involved in it without actually being there. But anyway, he said, witchcraft appears to be the skill of applying the plastic spirit of the world unto some unlawful purposes by means of a confederacy with evil spirits. That's as good a definition as any. Witchcraft is a human being seeking power, ability, insight, knowledge that is not available under normal circumstances to a human being. And they seek this power, this knowledge, this insight, this ability They seek it not for the glory of God, not to proclaim God's gospel, but for their own reasons. And so when they cannot get what they want from God, they go down the devil route. And you see this, obviously, the best biblical example is Saul, who could not get God to answer his phone calls, and so he went and got hold of a witch. Or to quote Satan himself, ye shall be as gods. And so Miss St. Thomas is right on board with that, and she understands what she is, and she understands what she's doing, and she's remarkably honest about it. But the problem she has is bad theology. She has a bad worldview in which the preeminent thing that must needs happen is that she gets her way, and that intersectional feminism is advanced and the patriarchy is battled, and bad theology. Now, we also have a guy by the name of Matthew Plunkett, and Matthew Plunkett is not a self-proclaimed witch, but he's some sort of scholar of some kind. And he says, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, not the Bible, mind you, not the Bible, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, whatever that means, I digress. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the witch first appears in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. In these texts, the witch simply represents a being who is intent on opposing the existing power structure of society. So in Mr. Plunkett's theology, the witch is she's the social crusader, she's the reformer, she is the unlikely hero of the story. I mean, take that for what it's worth. According to Mr. Plunkett, the individuals whom the Bible reveals as being in league with the God's enemies are simply trying to change society for the better. So that tells you what Mr. Plunkett thinks about God's idea of how society should be structured. Like I said, this reveals your theology. And if you can't see the issue with that, you might be past helping. I mean, this is, after all, the Street Preacher's Corner podcast, not the, untangle all the knots in your head podcast. Tell you what, I read all this nonsense, dear reader, and you get the benefit. Okay, so our last stop on the bad modern theology train is a Karina Chocano, and she wrote a lovely piece for what I believe was the Auckland Law Review, if my notes are correct. And in her little piece, she starts off by equating the witch trials to the Soviet Stalinistic show trials, in which the conclusion was foreordained before the trial started. She says that the term witch hunt is misused now by powerful men who want to make it sound like they are above the law, or make it sound like they're being persecuted when there's no reason to persecute them. And she goes into all that great stuff. So anyway, after she does all that, she says, women branded as witches tended to be on the older, poorer side and more autonomous or outspoken, and God help them if they had opinions. Now, in the Salem trials, that's not actually the case. As many issues as we're going to see with the Salem witch trials, that wasn't one of them. It wasn't primarily poor women, old women that are autonomous and outspoken and have opinions. But once again, in Miss Chocano's, however you say her name, in her theology, the patriarchy is just running around looking for the slightest little hammer they can beat down with, or the slightest little nail that sticks up that they can beat down. Actually, here's one more Chocano gem. Quote, the more authoritarian and patriarchal the context, the more likely powerful, independent, outspoken women, especially if they were older, would be branded as witches. This is a recurring thread in American politics to this day. Who can forget the chants of Bernie Sanders supporters in the 2016 presidential race, "Burn the witch," in reference to his opponent, Hillary Clinton? I probably read that 15 times putting all this together. I still think it's funny. Anyway, and so since your personal theology and your societal theology by extension is reflected in your reaction to the witch trials, is it really surprising that Boston, Massachusetts has a month-long commemoration every year in October of the witch trials? It's a month-long celebration. It goes on forever. And in October, Boston gets flooded with witches and witch wannabes who spend the day lamenting their oppression from the patriarchy and commiserating about their victimhood. I don't know how to break it to them. If you were really being oppressed, they would not throw you a parade. If you were really being oppressed, they would not let you have a festival, gals. And it's something you ought to think about. So hopefully, all that gibberish there has underscored the idea that for whatever reason, what a person thinks about the witch trials tells me a lot about their entire worldview. That's true of me, that's true of you, and that is absolutely true of the people that actually lived through it, the Puritans of 17th century New England. Now, I've talked about the Puritans quite a bit, and as they occupy a good chunk of early American church history, there is a lot to like about the Puritans and a lot to be very concerned about. The Puritans, in their doctrine and their basic worldview, live on today in our modern society in some of the Presbyterian brethren and some of the Reformed brethren, and that's just how it goes. If I remember, I will try to put a link to some of the other Puritan topics I've covered. But I'll tell you what the Puritans were not. They weren't idiots. They weren't primitives. They weren't superstitious blockheads. In fact, the frightening thing about the witch trials is how perfectly supported they were by the Puritan worldview. The things they did, and there were some terrible things that happened. And there were some terrible things that happened where people should have known better. And we'll get to that later. But the things that they did make absolute sense in light of how they thought the world worked and what they thought their place in it was. You can call the Puritans a lot of things, but they're not hypocrites in this area of life. The witch trials did not happen in a vacuum. They happened because of some very specific theology. Okay? Now, laying out my case, I'm going to be leaning real heavy on a guy named Cotton Mather. I think I may have mentioned him already. He is a Puritan minister. At one point, he was the president of Harvard, back when Harvard was a Bible college. Cotton Mather is the guy who wrote the book on the Salem witch trials. He wrote it, and then his dad added like a book to the end of it. And the name of the book is Wonders, The Wonders of the Invisible World. And it's quite a read. But even though Cotton Mather was not directly involved in the witch trials, he was around when it was going on. He was living in Boston at the time. And, Salem is kind of down the road a ways. And, but even though he wasn't directly involved, he corresponded real heavily with those people that were involved, and they sought his advice on what to do and how to address this, and is there any sort of precedent for how to proceed through something like this legally. He offered a lot of insight. And when it was all over said and done, him and his dad gathered up all the court documents and sort of analyzed them and came up with, what would we do different? What would we do the same? In fact, Cotton Mather spent a good chunk of his latter life after 1692, traveling around speaking on the subject of witches. And he wrote some books and Wonders of the Invisible World and some other stuff. And he became sort of the de facto expert on this stuff after the fact. But let's talk about the Puritans before we get into Cotton and quote Cotton at length, because Cotton is an interesting fella. I really feel like if I had known Cotton Mather, we probably would have been buddies, because he's an unusual fella. Very sure of himself, very determined, not arrogant or boastful, but very confident. But before we get to him, let's talk about the Puritans. So the Puritans were, in case you did not know, the Puritans were a sort of a sect, a breakaway sect of the Church of England, and fiercely Calvinistic in their doctrine. They loved them some John Calvin. Now that Calvinism is part of the recipe, as you'll see, and so when Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in 1534. He wound up appointing himself and future kings of England as the head of the church. So you went from having a pope that lived in Rome to having a pope that lived in London. Is basically what happened. And some people were okay with that. The Puritans were not okay with that. The Puritans took the position that since Jesus Christ is the head of the church, that having a king claiming to be the head of the church was just as stupid as having a pope claim to be the head of the church. Okay? And so they were constantly pushing back against the king's authority when it came to church matters. They said, "Look, you say you're saved. We'll accept your testimony, but you are no more in a position of authority over the church than any other man is. You certainly aren't the head of the church because that position is reserved exclusively for Jesus Christ." And so they're always pushing back against that. So by the time, Henry appoints himself head of the church in 1534, and the Mayflower leaves in 1620. So by the time the Mayflower leaves, packed to the gills with Puritans, the Puritans and the Crown had been butting heads for almost 100 years by then. And their departure from England to the New World to populate this English colony of Massachusetts, and some other places in New England, but primarily Massachusetts is where we're going to be focusing on. But their departure from England to the New World, what that is it is a chance, in their mind, it is a chance at a fresh start with a king that is, 3,000 miles away, and a chance to fulfill what they saw as their divine destiny. And this is another piece of the Puritan puzzle. So let's talk about that divine destiny for just a second. So Puritans held some beliefs that today we would call replacement theology, or sometimes people call it covenant theology. Sometimes people call it reformed theology. And it's a very broad set of beliefs that have some overlap. And I tend to call it replacement theology just because that's what I call it. I don't have an issue with someone using a different word for it. But they believed that the church was the fulfillment of, depending on who you ask, depending on how you want to word it, that the church of Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of Israel and the promises God made to Israel, or an extension of the nation of Israel, or a replacement for the nation of Israel in God's plan to redeem mankind, in God's plan to get the word out, in God's plan to eventually conquer the world. They were post-mill, they were post-millennial, and most Reformed brethren today are as well. So the idea is that Israel had a chance to be a theocracy with God as their head, and every time God laid that on the table, they failed to keep their end of the bargain. Israel had failed as a theocracy, and because of disobedience, and so Christ had commissioned the church to sort of succeed where Israel had failed. Now that's a pretty important thing to establish, because I, as a non-post-mill, non-Calvinist, non-replacement theologian, tend to see the church and Israel as being two vastly different things. And we could talk about that one of these days, maybe, but not today. So what you have is this group of people that got on the Mayflower, and when they saw themselves as a group of called out believers chosen from the foundation of the world and sent out into what they called a howling wilderness. That was their term for it. So this wilderness, I don't know if this sounds familiar if you read your Bible, this wilderness that they were going to, it had, for generations or centuries, it had been populated by devil-worshipping pagans. And their task, their divine destiny from God, was to go there and establish a theocracy, preach the gospel, and reclaim that land, conquer that land for Jesus Christ. The Puritans believed, and I've got some sweet quotes for you, that the cultures and the religions of the natives They weren't this, one with nature, peace with all men, Disneyland fable. They held that they held that the way the natives lived was full of darkness and superstition and idolatry, and I would tend to agree with them. In fact, I don't know how you could argue otherwise. Um, the the natives here in North America lived savage, brutal, idolatrous, bloodthirsty lives where they killed each other and killed themselves and sacrificed to devils. And so the Puritans said, well, the very land where we're building our houses and the very fields where we are planting our crops, those areas had been the sites of unspeakable practices that offended God in all His holiness, and now we're going to go live there. And there's a spiritual warfare to be expected. To a Puritan, the whole world was haunted. The whole world was full of devils. Here's a quote from Cotton Mather. The New Englanders are a people God settled in those which were once the devil's territories, and it may easily be supposed that the devil was exceedingly disturbed when he perceived such a people here, accomplishing the promise of old men and our blessed Jesus, that he should have the utmost parts of the earth for his possession. So they felt like their job was to go there and drive out preach to the pagans, but drive them out if necessary in order to populate that land with Bible-believing Christians. Okay? They believed they had the same sort of mandate under a lot of the same conditions that the nation of Israel had going into the land of Canaan. Replacement theology. I mean, you can't say that they're going half-hearted about it. So when odd things began to happen in 1692, paranormal things began to happen in 1692. Mather and the others, they saw that as a direct pushback from the forces of darkness against their little colony. And Mather gave this a lot of thought, and he wrote extensively about it, about why this happened. And he threw it out there that maybe this was happening because the new generation, the Pilgrims land in 1620, and they go through some rough times, and by 1692, you've had two generations living there. You had the generation that had fought and cut down the trees and cleared the land and planted the crops, and you had their kids, and now you had their grandkids. And Mather said, it's obvious to me that this new generation is not as devoted and not as battle-hardened as previous generations were. They didn't have the gumption. They didn't have the fight that their forefathers had had. Cotton Mather felt like that the church was in a terrible state of apostasy. He believed he was living in the Laodicean church age in the 1600s. And he said so. It is odd how nothing ever changes, isn't it? Anyway, Mather said the very devotion of these forlorn pagans to whom the devil is a leader are most bloody penances, and what woes indeed must we expect from such a devil as a Moloch, as relishes no sacrifice like those of human heart blood, and unto whom there is no music like the bitter, dying, doleful groans ejaculated by the roasting children of men. So Mather says we are living in a place where devils delighted in human blood being spilled. Devils delighted in children being burned alive. Devils delighted in murder and sin and all manner of offense against God. They delighted in it. And here we are. We're gonna live there, where the very ground is permeated and soaked with the blood of innocents. This is where we set up our camp, because this is where the battle is. And as God's chosen people, as God's army going forth to conquer the world for Jesus, we're going to be the tip of the spear. So are you getting what I'm saying? Are you getting your brain around What I'm saying, the Puritans believed they were at the tip of the spear in a cosmic war of good against evil, and that their personal victory was not an automatic outcome. In fact, a failure to obey God and to oppose sin could allow Satan to establish a little foothold in their God-fearing community. And what would that foothold look like? Well, it might just look like an outbreak of witchcraft among the people. Let me read you a quote here because I think it's a great quote. At such a time as this, ought ministers to do something extraordinary in pulling the souls of men out of the snares of the devil, not only by public preaching, but by personal visits and counsels from house to house. You heard it here first, folks. Cotton Mather, Puritan bigwig, president of Harvard College, he thinks the witch trials could have been avoided if there had been more street preaching and more door knocking. Some things never change. Seriously, though, Cotton Mather laid the blame at the feet of God's people for this strange business that was going on, this paranormal activity that was going on. And he said, Reformation is at this time our only preservation. He said that unless they lived a circumspect life, a life of holiness and devotion to God, a life where your heart burned with passion for the things of God, unless you lived that way, New England itself could fall back into the devil's hands. He said, Oh, 'tis a defiled land wherein we live. Let us be humbled for these defiling abominations, lest we be driven out of our land. So that's the stage. That's the world in which the Salem witch trials happened. It's a theocracy in which the government is the church and the church is the government. There's no separation of church and state. They never even heard of such a thing until way, way later down the road. Why? Their opinion would be, why would you want that? If God raises up men, according to Romans 13, to be God's ministers and to administer righteousness, why would you not want the church and the state to be the same? So you had a theocracy, and it was a theocracy of people that believed they were the chosen ones. They were chosen from the foundation of the world to come to this place and do spiritual battle in a land that belonged to the enemy. And that maybe some of these paranormal things that were going on were the direct result of them not doing that job good enough. That the devil had been given great liberty in the Salem and Massachusetts colonies in general. And this uptick in weird activity was proof of that. And so what should an Old Testament style theocracy do when witches refuse to convert and refuse to retreat? Well, you've got a verse that says, Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Now, with all that groundwork laid, we can begin to take a closer look at the events in Salem in 1692 and maybe draw some conclusions out of it and apply them to the world that you and I live in right now. I don't know how many installments this we're going to do. I've got a bajillion notes. And hopefully you find this interesting. If you do, please let me know. And I'll just continue on because I find it interesting, even if you don't. But in the meantime, this has been the Street Preacher's Corner. I'm your intrepid host, Michael. And as always, thank you for listening. And I will see you on the other side.